Okay. Hey, everybody. It's Thursday Chat. I'm Kelly Stokes, and today's guest speaker is Dr. Craig Weiner. Dr. Craig has been speaking internationally for quite some time on the many different aspects of trauma, and most recently the vagus nerve, which is something that has been apologize for that, has been in the news a lot lately. And if we could have everybody please put yourself on mute. I have, or Craig, could you go ahead and just say hello? I think that'll help with where we are on the speaker view here.
Hi, everybody.
Okay, thanks. That did it.
Okay.
Okay, so Dr. Craig was actually my first teacher for EFT level 1 and 2, and also matrix reimprinting. He and his wife Alina teach these trainings all over and a variety of other things. Highly recommended if it's something that you've looked into doing. Check out their training schedule, and I'm sure you're doing most of that online now as well, Craig?
We are.
Yeah. So everybody has the opportunity to join them if it's something that you're thinking about. So what I'd like to do today, Craig, is talk to you about three main things. The first one is this vagus nerve stuff that seems to be all the rage to be talked about. And I know you just gave an hour presentation on it. I think there was a whole series of talks by different people that were talking about Polyvagal Theory and the vagus nerve. So there's something there. But then I also want to get into trauma, of course, why we should be, paying attention to how trauma can affect us. And then also get into the ACE study and kind of some of the things that brings up. Sound good? And then we'll take questions from the gallery. Okay, so let's touch on this. I know the polyvagal thing is kind of a newer concept. It was like in the 1990s from the University of Chicago. But I've also heard so many people talk about the vagus nerve. So what do we need to know about that?
Well, first, thank you. It's delightful being here, joining you. I'm joining you from a little island outside Seattle. It's nice and toasty here in the cottage. And what I want to say is, just having you invited and having you and Ruthie here, that, our worlds intersect through the tapping world, right? But, EFT, matrix reimprinting, whatever techniques you want to use, what is the bigger purpose of all of them? And it's really to lead a life that it's our greatest possible life, through our minds, bodies, relationships, what we're doing in the world during this time of COVID. It's really, as we talk about the vagus nerve, and I'll bring it into that, is how resilient, how can we be in challenging circumstances and still be thriving? Right? It's interesting because I've had many conversations with people in our world, and it's almost like I can't tell people that I'm doing well. It'll make them feel bad. So, I really look at whatever we're going to discuss, whether, it's EFT, it's understanding trauma, it's having a trauma-informed approach, understanding polyvagal theory. What is the purpose of it? It's really to lead a richer, fuller, more expansive life, So yeah, there's been more summits and online education, and you're hearing many people for the first time are hearing things like vagus nerve and polyvagal. And, I've been a chiropractor for almost 30 years. And, I always knew what the vagus nerve was because it was one of the cranial nerves that we had to memorize back when we were doing anatomy. Right? It was like, okay, well, there's oculomotor and there's trigeminal and there's vagus. It's just one of the other nerves, so to speak, but it's really come into a greater understanding of its importance. The vagus nerve in Latin, it basically means the wanderer because it wanders throughout the entire body. The vagus nerve both informs the brain of what's happening in the body, and especially all the organs in the body, but it also sends information to them as well. So it kind of has, more than any of the nerves in the body, a master controlling effect. If you had to give one nerve, the head honcho title, that would be the vagus nerve. What you started to mention also, so anatomically, you could ask anybody in the medical profession what the vagus nerve is, and they could tell you from anatomy and physiology classes what it is and basics of what it does, because it's also one of the primary parasympathetic nerves. Okay, what does that mean? All right, so in the parts of our body, of our nervous system that are not so much under our conscious control, the automatic part of our nervous system that's running, most people know there's that part of our nervous system that gears us up, that accelerates us, that wakes us up, that gets us to run, that activates us, and that's the sympathetic part of our nervous system that we mostly think of our fight or flight system. The parasympathetic is kind of the yin, right? If we're going to talk about the yang system, which is the sympathetic, and the yin is the parasympathetic that nurtures, that restores, that rebuilds, that heals, etc. So the yin part of our nervous system is the parasympathetic, and the primary parasympathetic nerve is the vagus nerve. So beyond the anatomy, what's important and why we're even talking about it, I think the term polyvagal theory, since you mentioned it, was created by just a delightful, wonderful man named Stephen Porges. If you ever get the chance to see him speak online, he's like one of those academics that's brilliant, and yet you just want to give him a big hug. He's just such a love, and I adore him, and I think he deserves a Nobel Prize for the work he's doing, working with autistic kids and sound and integrating so many different things. He developed this theory, an evolutionary theory about the development of the vagus nerve, and divided it into multiple aspects, and hence poly, which means many, right? Many aspects of the vagus nerve. Okay. We could easily talk about this for a long time, which we're not going to. So I was thinking what is relevant and what would be kind of in a synopsis and short. So I'm seeing the chat. Stephen Porges is Stephen Porges out of Chicago, University of Chicago, PhD. And please don't get his big book. It will, it'll be great for a bookend or a doorstop. But if you're going to read it interested, there's, I'm forgetting, but it's basically the handbook, the short version, the soft cover book. But you can also just look on YouTube and find some talks of his, which I think would be more enjoyable than reading it for many. Anyway, so what does polyvagal theory mean? To me, one of the things that it most points to is how we handle, since we're going to be talking about ACEs and trauma, how our bodies respond in challenging situations. Okay? And it looks at the layers in which we respond and how we respond. And the first thing that I want to say is, one of the things that's really helpful to know is that when we're in situations of adversity or risk or threat, scary situations, that most of what's happening is below our level of awareness and consciousness and control. And that's really important to understand, because when people look to trying to understand why I did or didn't do something in a challenging situation, when I felt threatened or scared, why couldn't I have done this? Why didn't I do that? Why? Because, as Stephen described, something called neuroception, our bodies and our nervous system below the level of awareness are constantly scanning and determining whether a situation feels safe or not. Safety is everything. Safety determines how we're able to act or react well or not, or go into whatever response we do. And I think that's really important, because when we start to understand it's not me, it's my brain, it's not me, it's my body, then we can have a little bit more compassion for how we reacted in any one circumstance in life. And since our bodies are wired for survival, survival is the most important thing. Not being nice to somebody, not responding eloquently, not doing our best. It's whatever it takes to survive. And if our body's feeling threatened in any way, it's going to do whatever works to survive that situation. Trauma is primarily based on perception. So nobody can tell you if you've been traumatized or if something was traumatic for you, because your perception of the situation is everything. And your perception of what's happening at any one moment isn't just determined by the moment. It's determined by your previous experiences that are informing you whether this feels safe or not. So our history, and especially early history, wires in responses to how we respond in a situation. If somebody looks at you a certain way and you feel like you just want to hit them or run, you know, I don't know, they could have had something in their eye, right? I mean, it isn't necessarily the truth according to the circumstance, it's the truth according to our perception of the circumstance. Therefore, and I know this is a long answer to your first question, so I apologize, but I'm coming to the point, is that when, for whatever reason, our bodies feel threatened, scared, nervous, challenged in a moment, our first response tends to be a friend and befriend type of response. Like, okay, can I talk myself out of this? Can I make it nice? Can I make it better? Right? There's almost like an attempt to socially engage, as the terminology would be, the social engagement system, as Stephen calls it, the SES, to try to make an attempt to make the situation better and safer. And if that doesn't work, it drops into the next level of response. And that's like, okay, I can't fix this. I can't make this better. I'm getting the heck out of here. Or I'm pushing it away, which basically is our fight or flight sympathetic response, which is really the same response, just two different directions. Like one is towards and one is away, whichever one we feel more capable of doing, that's going to make the situation better. So some of us attack, verbally, physically, whatever. We go towards something. And others have learned that I feel more resourced and able to go that way. And so that's what we do. If the situation doesn't allow us to do that, or we don't feel able to do that or that because of who we are, how we see ourselves, our past history, etc., then we move toward, you know, we have a puppy, and I and I think of it this way: is anywhere in the house where there's an escape route, if we're chasing and playing and she looks at me and she thinks we're playing or I'm coming after, she'll dart in another direction. But if all of a sudden she goes through the bedroom into the closet and she sees me at the door like I'm after her, and she like looks behind her and there's a wall and a wall and a wall, it's like, okay. Like there's no attempt to run because it's pointless. There's three walls and there's me. So it's almost like this moment of dropping into that sense of helplessness of I can't attack and I can't escape, and I move into more of a freeze type response. So the anatomy that goes along with those levels of responses has very much to do with the polyvagal system and how we respond in those situations. And there's a lot more to that, but I think that given what we were going to talk about, it's helpful to understand that we have a system through especially our face and upper body and voice that is our social engagement system. And it's why we use our eyes and our voice and our connection through our upper body to try to friend and befriend and connect with people to make situations better. He's very conscious of the use of the tone of our voice that helps people feel safer and more relaxed or not. So there's that system. And then there's the more automatic responses of fight, flight, or freeze that our bodies drop into, whatever it's going to take to survive. Long answer, beginning exploration. I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Craig. I want to talk about now too why we should pay attention to trauma. And we're not just talking about trauma like these major big T traumas. We're talking about things that have happened to us through childhood that, just like you said, perception is everything, that we perceived a certain way and stored in our bodies as trauma. And how I'd like you to speak to this too is that, you know, we've been reading a lot of different books and hearing a lot of different speakers, and people have different takes on this, on whether we should pay attention to trauma at all or these things from our past, or whether we just say, no, if you have limiting beliefs or things that are holding you back, just change that belief. You know, just change your thoughts, and then that overwrites the belief. But those of us that have worked with people on, you know, the energy techniques kind of see that sometimes it's just not as easy as that. And it takes a little bit more to get to those things and release them. So can you kind of talk to that?
I know you, I know Ruthie, I know me. I know people that come to us every day and are wanting to change something in their life. They're wanting to do less of this or more of that, or be more like this or less of that, or more like. And what I would say is, if just knowing that was enough, then you wouldn't be here, right? If it was able to just, if knowing was enough, then all the people that are suffering would just change their minds. But changing your mind isn't really a best option when our bodies have been wired through trauma or through adversity, because our bodies tell us otherwise. You say, I am good enough, and your body feels not. Trauma comes in through the body and out through the body, and trauma affects not just our thoughts and not just our beliefs, but our physiology and our bodies and our minds as a combination. And it's, you know, it's why just trying to think differently, it's why just trying to do affirmations doesn't often work, because they're on a conscious level great. Yeah, I am beautiful. I am thin enough. I am just fine the way I am. I'm whatever. And yet how I feel is not that, and that's the one that wins. The subconscious and the subconscious that lives through our body in that relationship is always stronger, especially when it's wired in by trauma, because trauma informs us. I mean, think of it this way. We have something called the negativity bias. Why do we remember the negative things in life more than the positive ones? Why can't I remember every birthday party? Why do I remember the time that I fell off my bike and had to go to, you know, why do we remember those things? Because they're way more important for our survival than the good things. So since our bodies are wired for survival, it's more important for them to remember and hold on to the things that didn't work and threatened us than the things that were happy and joyous. So I'm not saying that there's not a place for positive thinking. I'm not saying that there's not a place for tuning into what one wants and believes and working with beliefs, but I don't think it's possible to really work with changing one's beliefs without dealing with what's holding the other beliefs in place. There's an anchor on the boat, and you could say, I want to go there, and I turn the motor on there, and the wind comes there, and I put the sails up there, and there's an anchor that's holding me down that's saying, you don't deserve that, you can't do that, you'll never really be able to do that, nobody in your family was ever able to do that, you're not pretty enough to do that, you're not wealthy enough to do that. Whatever those limiting beliefs are, the things that hold us stuck in life. And those things that keep us stuck in life are based on the experiences that we've had, most notably the trauma, because trauma events and wiring has a much stronger effect than other things because of survival. And when you said, you know, you're talking about, you know, big versus little t traumas, it's like most people, if you ask them, don't think they have a trauma-filled life. And I would say I've never met anybody that doesn't have a history of trauma. But then you have to start to define trauma. And so, you know, actually a nice definition of trauma, and this is from a governmental mental health association, is trauma results from some event or some series of events in life or a set of circumstances, something that happened to you, that's experienced by an individual as either physically or emotionally harmful or even life-threatening, that has lasting adverse effects on a person's functioning in their mental, physical, social, or spiritual well-being. So you could say, well, I understand how somebody could be traumatized if their house burned down. I could see if somebody got traumatized if they were in a bad accident or a hurricane. Wow, that was good. A hurricane or earthquake or natural disaster or sexual trauma or so many different things. And those are clearly traumatic events. But because we go back to perception, the time that I went up to the blackboard in second grade and couldn't do the math homework on the board and all the kids started laughing and I was so ashamed and embarrassed that I peed in my pants. Now, that's not an earthquake. My life wasn't endangered, really, right? But in that moment, the decisions and the feelings that were embedded were like, I just want to die. I'd rather be dead. It's like life will never be the same. I will never be accepted by anybody. And the decisions and feelings that get wired in during a moment like that, even though it's not truly life-threatening, go to very deeply how I see myself in the world and what I'm able or not able to do. And so little traumas can be more impactful than the big traumas that we normally think of as traumas. Both are significant, but I'm just wanting to make sure that little t traumas, littler ones like that, can be just as profound, if not more, than the so-called more accepted or bigger ones. And so this is what's going into, now that we're hearing more about being trauma-informed, how these traumas affect how we are in the world and what jobs we take and whether we go to school and who we think we can be with as a partner and what we're able or not able to do are based on these traumas, especially the ones that were wired in when our nervous system was developing when we're young and we're children, even more pronounced.
Yeah, and so Craig, so how can we kind of get in touch with how these things might be affecting us and how we can begin to heal from those things?
That's a great question. The challenge with the question, or the challenge of that question, is we know what we already think is important. Right? Like if you ask somebody what traumas, they'd list 2 or 4, whatever they have in their life, right? So, you know, this is a challenge that came up. So the founder of EFT, Gary Craig, did something quite profound. He came up with this personal peace process where it was kind of a guide for somebody working on healing the adversity of their past, right? But he even knew, okay, if he told you to sit down and list the traumas, people would be like, well, let's see, okay, there's that one. That wasn't bad. That wasn't as bad as anybody else. Lots of people have, okay, and there's that one. And you'd come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, on a hand. And he's like, okay, we need to reword this because there's way more of adverse impacting events in your life that you're not counting on that list. So how about we ask it this way? What are things that happened in your life that you wish you could have skipped? Now, that opens the door a bit to, well, I wouldn't have called that a trauma, but I do wish that I hadn't gone through that or hadn't experienced that or that hadn't happened to me. So it is why when as practitioners we're doing EFT or whatever technique we're doing, often somebody will minimalize some event in their, minimalize something in their life that they think, that's not a big deal. And suddenly they start tuning into it and their body reminds them, this was a very big deal to you then. Just because you're big now and you're grown up and you don't think that was such a big deal, how your body remembers it as something very significant. So like, for example, you know, you think about the time that, you know, your parents, you know, holidays, you get together and your parents bring up the story when you were a kid and it's really funny to everybody except to you. And they bring it up and it's like, oh God, that was so embarrassing. But what you don't tune into is what that felt like when it happened. And that's still often living and very alive in you. And all of a sudden something reminds you of that, or you're working in a therapy or EFT session or whatever, and you're like, why am I crying? Why is this upsetting me so much? It was 50 years ago and it wasn't that big a deal. I've talked about it a million times, because there's this level of subconsciousness. And, you know, Joe Dispenza would say our body is our subconscious in a sense, right? So that is very much living and alive here, but very different here, right? So when we start to do this work and trauma work, we're often very surprised at the depth to which we're still carrying things, and we don't realize how much we're carrying them until maybe we're in a place that we're vulnerable, and maybe we're in a place that feels really safe to feel it, or maybe it's coming up for a particular reason for us to finally deal with. And we realize, wow, there's a lot there. So how do you go back and do that? I think guided by somebody is very helpful, practitioner, somebody that can support you to kind of look at. But that might be a place to start, is going through the different periods of your life, either the time periods or the ages or the places you lived or the relationships you had, and beginning to look at, all right, that wasn't good. that was something I'd like to skip. That might be a place for helping to discover.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point with the personal peace procedure. Um, and you know, I know there's a lot of science that is supporting how these traumas now affect us. And one of the big things is that ACE study, the adverse childhood events. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So a doctor named Vince Felitti worked for Kaiser, right? And he was running in Southern California an obesity study for very, significant obesity. And so the study, that he began this whole thing with, that began before the ACEs, was just to measure how well we're doing with this. And the people that, and especially the women that were losing the most weight, seemed to be dropping out of the study the quickest, which made zero sense to him. It's like, okay, you guys are making the most progress. Why would you be like leaving the program? So he decided to sit down and like interview some people and find out what, what's going on here. And he had a thorough interview process and was finding out about their physical history and their, their physiological history and their mental, emotional, and sexual history. And he met, as the story, as he tells it, with this one woman and asking her why she dropped out, et cetera. And she was feeling not good. And when he was asking her questions, he mistakenly asked about her sexual history. How much did you weigh when you first became sexual? And she said like 65 pounds. And he meant to ask age, but it's like, what do you mean? That doesn't make sense. Were you anorexic? And she's like, no, but I was 9. It's like, okay. And he started to ask her, and he started to find out that as she started to lose weight, she started to feel very unsafe because she was getting lots of attention. And lots of attention to her body reminded her of what it was like to get not okay attention when she was young. They started to do a lot more research and find out over and over that people that were dropping out of the study that felt unsafe because there was a history of especially sexual childhood trauma. Okay. That then began like this kind of like moment, like, how could we not know this? How could this be so obvious to us and we don't know about this relationship? And so he then got involved with Dr. Amda from the CDC. They then did a huge, thousands and thousands and thousands of people to start to find out about the relationship between childhood trauma and adult challenges. This has been probably the most replicated study that makes the connection between physical health, behavior, and early childhood trauma. Not saying that's the only time we can have trauma, but profound because of how it affects and wires into the brain body. So 10 questions were in the original ACE study. They're not the only 10 types of trauma. They're actually then soon going to be coming out with the adult trauma study, et cetera. But for these, they looked at physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, a loss of parent for divorce, separation, death, etc., violent treatment of the mother, somebody in the household that was jailed, somebody in the household that had mental illness, somebody in the household that had like substance abuse or alcohol abuse. So you get 1 point for each of those if it was positive for you. Okay, and it wasn't necessarily just a one-time thing. It was something that was repeated. So when you start to look at the correlations of these scores, it's incredible. So we start to look at, for example, the likelihood of having increased number of ACEs that goes up for everything from physical disease, from liver disease, heart disease, earlier death is astronomical. So for example, somebody with no ACEs, 1 out of 16 of them smoke. For somebody with 4, 1 in 6. If you look at the rate of alcoholism with no ACEs, it's 1 in 69. If you look at it with 4 or more ACEs, it's 1 in 6. If you look at attempted suicide, it's 1 in about 100 for the general population with no ACEs. It's 1 in 5 with 4 or more ACEs. And it's not just behaviors like earlier sexual activity, smoking, alcohol and drug abuse. You start to look at, for example, increased depression, increased addiction. You start to look at, for example, life expectancy. So if you've got an ACE score of 6 or more, you've got a 20-year shorter lifespan expectancy. So when we start to look at the connection between early trauma, so somebody comes in with heart disease, what's the cause of that? Bad diet or childhood trauma at the heart? You start to look, and this is what, when we talk about being trauma informed, means changing the way you see the entire world. So for example, I just had reposted an article lately about, given the times that we're in, we'll just say a white supremacist-like hate group person. And it was his healing that he was writing about. And there was lots of childhood trauma. And for this person, what happened was hating basically became an addiction. I mean, and it was supported by his environment, etc. But the hate became his addiction that fed his sense of safety and self-control and power given his trauma. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong or all of that, but if you start to think about how is it that we understand, well, alcoholism and drug addiction is a disease which is often based on trauma. Why is that acceptable, but hatred not? Think about it. So when we become trauma informed, you start to look at people that are in prison, you're probably going to find a 99.9% history of childhood trauma. So when we start to look through a trauma lens to how we teach people, how we treat kids, how we work with incarceration and justice, how we work with addiction, how we work with, you know, in the addiction world, you know, Gabor Mate, who's one of my heroes, he would say, an addiction is not the problem, it's the answer. And you're like, what are you talking about? It's like, there's such a hole here that needs to be filled that the only way that they can feel like they can survive day to day is by fixing that pain and that suffering. So the substance or the activity fixes that temporarily. So the substance is their answer. It's their savior. It's the way they survive. It's not a problem for them. So this whole idea of becoming trauma informed starts to have us, to the degree that we're able to, look through a lens of understanding of early trauma sets up a pattern of what we do and what we don't do, and how we approach schools, justice, politics, law, community, family, to the degree that we're able to understand that, and to the degree that we're able to be compassionate, etc., understanding about why people are the way they are and why they act the way they do. And so for me, EFT is about us healing our own trauma so that we don't have to pass it on generationally. And that's a whole nother topic about how we pass on generational trauma from one to the next, from a parent to a child, both through actions and observations and genetically as well. But that's a whole nother topic.
That's a whole big area that is so fascinating, and maybe we could even have you back sometime to talk more about that, because that is just completely fascinating. But yeah, I love, you know, talking about this being trauma informed, because I think it helps us understand ourselves better and start to heal some of our stuff, and realizing some of that stuff that's there to be healed, but also being much more compassionate for others, and knowing that, you know, the way they're responding, the way they're behaving is not just always a conscious decision, but it's based on so much more of that. So Craig, I want to...
Which means doing our own work. And we can only be compassionate to the other to the extent that we can. And we can't, you know, we can blame ourselves. I should be more compassionate. I should be more empathetic. But, well, you know, there's reasons when we can't. Because only to the extent that we've done our own healing can we have room and spaciousness for that kind of empathy and compassion. Because if I were harmed by somebody in a particular way, if I had a narcissistic father, et cetera, much harder for me to be compassionate and empathetic to one that acts a similar way, right? So our history, you know, what is the most likely predictor of our history? Our past, right? So if you want to know what your future is going to be like, the best way to know what it's going to be like is to look to your past for information about that until we resolve, heal, do the work we need to do. You know?
Yeah, so true. Okay, so I opened it up to the gallery view, and we'll go ahead and take some questions. Does anybody have a question? Sally, do you have one?
I do. What about if you know you've had a trauma, but you've taken it and put it in a lead box, and I'm an older person, never been able to unlock that box, can't remember, but know that it was there. There's no way that I've been able to access it. I've been able to forgive, but I have not been able to access the memory.
Okay.
What do you say to that?
Great question. And it kind of prompts the question of, because I have a trauma, does that mean that I have to resolve it?
Right.
It's a great question, isn't it? Like, from kind of an EFT worldview, there's kind of this automatic, well, of course, right? However, sometimes opening that lead box destabilizes your life and doesn't help. So I want to just say that I don't have an automatic response to that. That's a yes or no, or we should, or, well, until you open that box and see what's inside, your life is going to be incomplete, right? I mean, that's a bunch of doo-doo. So I think that we can, so a few responses to that. Number one, not necessarily. Maybe you're doing just fine and something happened you have a feeling of, and it's like, who knows, maybe I'll never remember. You can tap on or work with your feelings about what you think happened, what you imagine happened, because that's affecting you, your thoughts about it and your feelings about it. I don't know what happened, but it still makes me feel that. So you can, for me, since we're talking about tapping and it's infuses the group, I'll just use that as a therapeutic intervention of discussion. So if you're tapping on that, anything that's a significant trauma, I would not be doing myself. I'd be working with the safety of a practitioner. Because what happens if that box opens? Mm-hmm. Right? You can't be both the person that's flailing in the water and the person that's rescuing you and sending you a life preserver. Right? You can't do both.
Right.
Okay? Not easily and not well, let's put it that way. I don't recommend it. So that's one piece. So you can tap on and work with just your feelings or fear, because I've had many people that have had a memory that they thought were there and they were scared what it was, and it actually emerges and it's like, that's it? That's the big deal? That's what was in the freaking box? So sometimes it's that, right? And there are techniques like matrix reimprinting where sometimes you imagine what's in the box and it's not necessarily true or not, but it's still where your imagination goes, and through your imagination or dream work or whatever other way, it's like, okay, I'm imagining this happened, I don't know, but it feels like it did. Well, there's no like arbiter in the sky that says, well, that was right and that was wrong, that didn't I'm not talking about legalities here, I'm talking about personal work with it. Working with a practitioner, what is it that you think happened? What is it that you imagine happened? We're not gonna go back and check your history and look up in the, there's no place to look to see if it did, because it was only you and the other person. But you can still work with feelings about it that way, through made up, created, imagined, what may have. So there are ways, if you really feel the calling, to work with something that you can work around, kind of have workarounds with that. Does that make sense?
Yes, I feel like my inner child revealed it. She knew. Okay. And but I as an adult don't remember it, and I think I've overcome whatever it is. It doesn't traumatize me, but it was my subconscious or my inner child that was the one who came to me, and also spiritually I was told. So I know it happened. So
yeah, so please know that I'm not questioning at all the validity of it happening or not happening. If that came across, it certainly wasn't what I meant to say. What I do want to say is, with my clients, because I'm not a licensed mental health care provider, I'm not a psychotherapist or psychologist, my bigger question, if you were a client, is how is that impacting your life now? And if you answered me, I don't think it really impacts my life at all, then part of me is like, then why are we working on it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and another thing that I want to say that, it's kind of a fingers on a chalkboard for me, is when some other person, albeit a healer, a shaman, a spiritualist, or whatever you want to call, tells us about things that they see happened to us, I have a really hard time with that. I think that those professions need to be much more trauma informed, because we had no idea, we had no thoughts or feelings about it. And now in a sense, they've implanted this idea that we can't get to because it may or may not have happened. They just threw into our pot this question about what, so I'm not saying that happened with you at all. I'm just saying that I see that happen, whether somebody's doing a past life regression and they're telling me they see this happen, and that can traumatize and really affect people, because it was almost like this traumatic memory was implanted where it didn't exist for me before. Yeah. So that concerns me when I hear those stories.
It concerns me as well.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question, Sally. Does anybody else have a question?
Link assessment. So ACEs, okay, so thank you, Julie, for putting in things. We've got some articles. So if you go into EFTtappingtraining.com, we've got articles and interviews, and we've got the ACE questionnaire. If you're really interested in ACEs and are fine with being overwhelmed with about 10 emails a day on all different types, acesconnection.com is a great organization, but you will get like 10 to 20 emails a day from them, something like that, which if, you want those resources is great, but it can be overwhelming for others.
Yeah, and Craig, do you want to tell us about what you and Alina have, what offerings are coming up for you in case people are interested in that?
I mean, we do a lot of things, and everything, of course, right now is online. So, the foundational training for EFT is what's called EFT level 1 and 2. And so we offer that about every 2 to 3 months. So the next one's in February, and then there's one in April. March, we have one just for mental health care professionals. So those are 3-day trainings in learning all the foundational techniques of EFT to use with yourself and to use with others. If you choose to move on to certification, it's the beginning step. So we have that, if that's something that calls you. We do that in conjunction with EFT International, our accrediting body. For people that are not interested in going that deep, we do have some other courses, like the beginning of each year in January. We run basically a manifestation course, which is kind of like setting the tone for the year. So it's like a 4-week course using ritual, using EFT, using a variety of methods to really set your focus. And we look at that with using EFT, clearing what's getting in the way of you manifesting what you want in your life. And so we do it every year in January to kind of set the tone for what we want to create in the next year. So that's, something we do. We have like a beginning online downloadable class on EFT if you're looking for more bite-sized things. So you can find those in our store. But what I would say is, you might be, what else do I want to say? Matrix reimprinting is something that you've mentioned. The challenge is that, right, it has to be done live and in person, not online to be taught. It's not allowed to be taught otherwise. And you have to have an EFT level 1 and 2 background to do that. So it's not something I can teach a newbie, unfortunately. And so, yeah, we have lots of research. We've got science of tap. If you're interested in the science behind EFT and tapping, you can go to this scienceoftapping.org. So, I mean, we do lots of stuff. We do lots of teaching. We run the biggest, the really large emotional freedom technique support group on Facebook. And that's a great place to just kind of watch and get resources. We send out newsletters and we have a podcast called EFT Nation that's on our website. And so about every 2 weeks, we do a podcast on all the different things about EFT that are about 20-minute snippets. So they're easy to do when you're exercising. So anyway, so there's lots of resources, I guess, but stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I always include a link, Craig, to your website with the next email that goes out.
Thank you.
So if anybody has anything last that they'd like to say, we'll go ahead and end the meeting then. And thank you so much. That was just a wealth of information. I love hearing you speak.
It's been my pleasure. And Ruthie, you can take off on holes that you're like, oh, I wish he said that. And oh, I want to talk about that and that. So whatever, yeah.
I just thought we'd play with resourcing next week. Just play with
I think that's wonderful. I think that's great. It's something that's so important. It really is, and especially in these most interesting of times, to really tune into things that make us feel good and things that nourish us like the vagus nerve does. And how do we stimulate that nurturing of the vagus nerve to restore? And you know, there's so many places where stress is going out and having us react, that if we're not consciously doing things to restore and rebuild, then we tend not to, because, you know, survival doesn't say, oh, it's all about resting and regenerating and restoring, right? That doesn't tend to be our go-to thing unless we consciously make an effort to do that. So I think that's fabulous.
So true, and so important now to be making a conscious effort to keep ourselves calm and in balance.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so I'm going to go hold my puppy. It's my greatest resource right now. And Kelly, thank you for doing this for everybody here, and for inviting me. It's been a pleasure and a great way to start my day.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming, everybody. And have
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you,
Thank
Kelly.
you.
Craig. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Doing this,
Bye.
Kelly. Okay.